Huh. Apparently, if you die of radiation poisoning, you get buried in steel under concrete because they're concerned about you coming back as a nuclear zombie. Welcome back to the Chernobyl series. Today we're looking at episode 3 of HBO's Chernobyl series depicting the infamous disaster that ultimately shaped the nuclear industry into what it is today. It is called Open Wide, O Earth. We start off with the three guys who were sent to shut off water flow to the tank in the previous episode to prevent an explosion. Here they are, fully dressed out, working in radioactive water. Yeah, they're definitely contaminated. Hey, they made it. Get radiation protection technicians to check them out. They are most definitely contaminated. And you don't want to approach them in their contaminated state of them just getting a whole bunch of radioactive funk on you. But instead, they handed them some vodka. Sure, why not? Now we cut ahead to 4 days after the explosion. We saw her husband from episode 1. He was a firefighter. One of 134 firefighters suffered acute radiation sickness, and 28 of those people would actually die in real life. The nurse says she can't touch him. There is potential for radiation to have damaged his immune system, as acute radiation sickness does cause cell damage, specifically fast dividing cells. He also suffered some burns and other injuries while firing the fighters, so that's probably why she's advising her not to touch him. There's a reason why they put burn victims in a completely separate ward of a hospital. Asking her why she's not pregnant. I hope they're not going with this the way I think they're going with this. We'll come back to this later. She holds him anyway. It would be hard not to after what all he's been through. Not sure what that funky glow's supposed to be. Again, I hope they're not going the way it could be interpreted they're going.
Someone decided the evacuation zone should be 30 kilometers when we know here, cesium-137 in the Gonal district, that's
Cesium-137 is a metal that is a common fission product of U-235. Fission products are what come from when a nucleus is fission, and it's typically twin-peaked. There is a peak around atomic mass of 130 to 140. There's another one in the 80 to 100 range. Because it's twin peak, this is known as the Dolly Parton curve for, I'm assuming, highly scientific reasons. He is concerned about particular cesium-137 spreading via radioactive plume.
Good. Yes? But the temperature is rising.
Well, your case of good news and bad news. Temperature is continuing to rise despite the fire, if you will, being out. And it's rising due to decay heat. Fission products still emit heat after the reactor is shut down, albeit far less.
It's from the cladding on the fuel rods. Meaning what? A meltdown has begun.
So a meltdown, not a real industry term, but it means fuel damage and melting of the cladding and other bits of core and pressure vessel. You guys are a bit late to the party. The meltdown actually started 4 days ago during the actual accident, and a couple of episodes ago when the core was damaged due to that crazy, unsafe test where they violated procedures that were already pushing safe operating limits. And now we cut to 2 days later.
Anticipated. The concrete pad will last for 6 to 8 weeks, but after that, Legasov estimates a 50% chance that the fuel will breach the pad and melt down into the groundwater.
This is another problem of having no true containment vessel. Not only did it fail to keep the fission products from exploding outward, it also failed to keep them from going, from melting through, or it has the potential to fail. It didn't actually fail. A meltdown occurred in the 3 Mile Island accident, but was safely contained thanks to their containment building. Nobody died in that event.
Water supply for approximately 50 million people, not to mention crops and livestock, would be unusable. We're recommending we install a heat exchanger under the pad to lower the core temperature and halt the meltdown. And in order to do that, I'm told that we will need all of the liquid nitrogen in the Soviet Union.
That's a lot. Again, they never should have defeated their own safety systems that put themselves into a situation like that. Remember, we're talking 2,000 degrees Celsius, and water wouldn't work at that temperature because it would explode at 2,000 Celsius upon direct contact. It's that hot. Also, there is no pressure vessel or piping to even connect normal water through a typical heat exchanger that you would have at the plant. Though the sand and lead that they poured via helicopter would actually absorb most of the heat. They dropped 4,000 plus tons of that stuff. And even though a lot of them missed, it just created, there's enough mass to just absorb all of that heat. But again, it's important to have a contingency. While decay heat continues, the overall amount of it will drop slowly over time, and it didn't actually reach the groundwater in real life, but it is accurate that they were very concerned about that possibility.
The immediate effects subside. The patient appears to be recovering. Healthy even, but they aren't. This usually only lasts for a day or two.
Continue.
Cellular damage begins to manifest.
I really wish I could show the full clip of this here on YouTube, but I can't due to copyright restrictions. But that is a horrifyingly accurate portrayal of what happens when you get a lethal dose and acute radiation poisoning. Again, 28 people died that way in real life.
What about us? You've gotten a steady dose, but not as much of it. Not strong enough to kill the cells, but consistent enough to damage our DNA. So, in time, cancer.
And there you have a difference between an acute dose or a lower but still relatively high dose over time, probably in the realm of 25 to 100 Rontgen or REM over the course of however many weeks they were there. Though him being so certain about the cancer isn't entirely accurate, the factors of them developing cancer within the next 5 years, it's implied to be 5 years in a different scene, is difficult to estimate. Yes, some of the Chernobyl workers got cancer and others doing this type of work, which is why the UN estimates the death toll as 50 as opposed to 31. But many of those Chernobyl workers lived 20 plus years after the event, and when they died, they didn't die of cancer.
I've worked the numbers over and over, presuming the worst possible conditions in an RBMK reactor. And I always get the same answer.
Which is,
It's not possible.
So she's a nuclear physicist. I actually think she is a composite character representative of a team of physicists and experts based on her behavior in previous episodes. Not to knock on physicists, they do great work, but now we're getting into the realm of the difference between physicists and engineers and operators. One way she could find out, look at their testing procedure. Look at the basis for each step. Look at what their operational risk and operational margin is with each change in power, control rod position, defeating their safety systems, and ask everything that could go wrong. That's how you can kind of figure it out. Also, you can question the operators and plant managers and all the people associated with the test. They probably also got questioned by the party as well, but they're not looking too good at this point. Then we fast forward another day later. Now they're getting as many laborers as they can to dig this tunnel underneath to install their liquid nitrogen heat exchanger.
Gave to the Black Sea, all of it. Forever, they say. They want you to stop that from happening.
So here's a senior party member addressing a group of coal miners. Now, coal miners are used to doing dangerous work. Coal mining, especially back then, takes years off of their life, and now we're adding Chernobyl to that. I really like this scene. This is their miner's way of showing they're agreeing to go with them. I really admire their courage doing these tunnels in real life. You're about to see how dangerous these things are.
These work? To an extent.
Here we have the chief of the coal miners arriving on site, talking about those masks. Said to an extent. I mean, that's fairly certain. What he means by that is that only filters out airborne particulate radioisotopes. Anything just from being near the destroyed reactor of just gamma radiation that you get from that, it will not help you in the slightest. What it's realistically used for is if you have a short range, such as alpha or beta radiation sources, you really don't want to take those internally. So it's specifically for airborne alpha or beta sources, because gammas will just go straight through you. And gammas are the vast majority of the radioisotopes at Chernobyl.
I'm not 12 meters below ground now.
They mentioned earlier that they were safe being below ground, digging the tunnel, but they're not below ground now because the ground would absorb a lot of the radiation. It's a fair point. They're all getting dosed while they're sitting here having this conversation. Now we fast forward to 9 days after the explosion, with the mining operation having commenced. Mining by hand is dangerous work already. Now factor in the questionable integrity of the ground with the melted remains of the Chernobyl reactor core slowly advancing towards them. I can only imagine the amount of stress in this sort of job.
We can't breathe without masks. We can't breathe with the masks. It's like a fucking oven. We need them.
Remember, the melted core is at 2,000 degrees Celsius, 6 meters above their head. They got a temperature reading of 50 degrees Celsius or 122 degrees Fahrenheit. That exceeds the highest heat stroke risk level. At that point, OSHA, if they existed in the Soviet Union, would require you to take water breaks every 15 minutes and cools down to avoid heat stroke. Plus, you also have in danger of being engulfed within that hazardous atmosphere, being a mine with only one entrance at the end of a long tunnel. Oh, and the radiation. So yeah, this is very dangerous work.
Dust. I'm sorry. fans.
So this job is dangerous either way. Die of heat stroke or die of radiation. I'm not actually sure which is more risky. Probably the safest thing for them to do is to continually switch out more laborers. The Soviet Union prides themselves over having a vast industrial labor force, including coal miners, and radiation dose is cumulative over time. So there's less overall harm caused if you have a lot of coal miners and they each get a little bit of dose versus a small number of coal miners getting a much larger dose. This would also be a safer option for heat stress as well.
Chernobyl exactly like him. It isn't safe for you. He's my husband, not anymore.
How is it not safe for her? Again, he isn't a radiation source. He received a lethal dose. Those are not the same things. His body is not emitting that dangerous amount of radiation. That makes about as much sense as saying you could get drunk by standing next to someone who is drunk or touching them. Again, I understand it about being more unsafe for him as of him getting an infection, but he's dying anyway. Is she talking emotional stress, like he's too far gone and she could consider him dead already? I don't want to be in her position.
Why didn't you initiate an emergency shutdown? Why didn't you press the AZ5 button?
I did. I reported the increase.
This is a bit outside of context. At the point where he did press the emergency shutdown button, it was too little too late. The fuel was already damaged to the point where the control rods wouldn't work. And the geometry was so screwed up that since the control rods wouldn't fully insert, you gain a whole bunch of reactivity at the bottom of the core, creating a very unstable situation. He should have pushed the emergency shutdown button, but much earlier in the testing procedure. I'm assuming a more detailed description is coming up in a later scene or perhaps a later episode, but I'll go into more detail when that happens.
You let her in that room, inside the plastic, touching him. Did you know she's pregnant?
It's not true.
And this is what I was afraid that they were going to do earlier. Unborn babies are at a much higher risk for radiation, but they're acting like radiation spreads like COVID. It doesn't. Or he is still contaminated somehow. He's not contaminated at this point. His clothes were removed and his burns were all cleaned in a previous episode. So there is no risk for her or her baby at this point. And I actually thought they were just concerned about her mental health, but this is pretty bad. Now we cut ahead to Legasov briefing the party members about the next steps for Chernobyl.
There is an enormous amount of radioactive debris and contamination spread out across a zone of approximately 2,600 square kilometers.
That number's accurate. That's how big they make the Chernobyl exclusion zone, or about a 30-kilometer radius. So they got that one right.
Around the power plant itself, which will of course still be extremely... There will be deaths.
They're talking about bringing in liquidators, upwards of 500,000 people to do a bunch of deconning, maneuvering of material, including like the ground in that 30-kilometer radius zone. And then ultimately building a sarcophagus temporary structure that they put over the remains of the destroyed reactor. He said there would be deaths. The actual death toll, again, 50 based on a UN estimate. So they still are afraid of thousands of deaths, and I still think that's a valid, historically accurate concern, but not accurate in terms of what actually happened. So, yeah. That sarcophagus, by the way, was just recently reinforced in 2016 with the Chernobyl new safe confinement structure. and that is designed. It's like a big arch they just put on top of that sarcophagus, and that's going to keep things safely contained for at least another century.
I don't know, 40% chance maybe.
You said 50.
All right, so here they're at least admitting that it might not melt through at all, given it's sort of a percentage chance. It didn't in real life, by the way, but it was important that they had that contingency plan of using liquid nitrogen. It's always good to have a backup plan when dealing with something that had such a high risk of damage if it were to actually happen. Here's what they're doing to people that actually died of acute radiation poisoning. So wooden box and steel welding it shut. That's a bit excessive. And if you thought that wasn't enough, let's just go ahead and pour a bunch of concrete on them just to be sure. Again, I think in this universe, they're treating people like if they have a fatal dose, they are now a deadly radiation source. That's not at all how it works. And it's pretty disappointing to see that. And that's where the episode ends. Man, those whole "he is dangerous to her" scenes is probably the most egregious scenes in this episode. It's the equivalent of the past episode's 2 to 4 megatons scene. One thing I didn't mention earlier is how fast people got burns and died of radiation poisoning, as they did a little bit of time compression with that for the drama, and I was okay with that just for the purpose of telling the story. They did describe acute radiation poisoning pretty accurately. This series is just an odd one, though, as in they do several things that are accurate and several things that are quite inaccurate. I don't really like that. I'm kind of more of the whole all or nothing approach, because the problem is the layperson is going to think both of those things were accurate and not going to know, and who would blame them? So this is a weird mixed bag approach. Let me know if you think that is a good approach for storytelling or not. I don't think it would have taken much more effort for them to get the right information for where they were wrong, because they clearly had some experts, because they've been right in certain scenes, and it might not be a question of effort, it's more of a question of wanting to make the show more dramatic. Thank you very much for watching. I'll see you next time.